Jake Morrison walked into the small coffee shop on 5th Street like he did every morning before work, and the bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The place smelled like fresh roasted beans and cinnamon, and he rubbed his tired eyes because last night had been another late one at the warehouse. Behind the counter stood a woman he had never seen before, and she was absolutely stunning with long silver hair that seemed to shimmer under the lights, and eyes that were an impossible shade of violet. She looked up at him and smiled, and for a moment Jake forgot how to breathe. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was like music. "And what can I get for you today?" "Just a black coffee, please," he managed to say, and he fumbled for his wallet. She moved with unusual grace as she prepared his drink, and her fingers were long and elegant, and Jake noticed she wore strange silver bracelets that looked ancient. When she handed him the cup, their fingers touched, and he felt a shock run through his whole body like static electricity, but much stronger. She leaned forward across the counter, and her violet eyes locked onto his, and she reached into her apron pocket. "Finally, I found you," she whispered, and she pressed something cold and metallic into his palm. Jake looked down and saw a ring sitting in his hand, and it was made of some dark metal he did not recognize, with strange symbols carved all around it. The symbols seemed to glow faintly with a blue light. "What is this?" he asked. But when he looked up, the woman was staring at him with an intensity that made his heart race. "That ring belonged to your ancestor," she said quietly, "and he was a great warrior who saved my people 500 years ago." Jake laughed nervously because this had to be some kind of joke or maybe a strange marketing thing. "Listen," he said, "I think you have the wrong person, and I am just a warehouse worker, and my family is not special or anything like that." The woman shook her head slowly, and her silver hair moved like liquid silk. "Your blood carries the mark," she said, "and I have searched across 3 continents in 7 years to find you, and my name is Lyria, and I am not from this world." Jake felt his mouth go dry, and he looked around the coffee shop, but there were only 2 other customers, and they were not paying attention. "You are crazy," he whispered, but his hand closed around the ring anyway. Lyria smiled sadly, and then she did something impossible, and her ears shifted, becoming pointed, and her eyes glowed brighter, and for just a second Jake saw something behind her like wings made of light. "I am an elf," she said simply, "and my people are dying, and you are the only one who can help us." Jake stumbled backward, and his coffee sloshed in. The cup in his mind was racing because this could not be real. Elves were not real, and magic was not real and beautiful. Women did not just appear in coffee shops with ancient rings. But the ring in his hand felt warm now, and it seemed to pulse with energy. Lyria reached under the counter and pulled out a small leather bag. "Inside this bag are things that will prove I am telling the truth," she said. But we must go somewhere private. And there are those who hunt me, and they will come here soon." "Who is hunting you?" Jake asked, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "The Shadowborn," Lyria said. "And they are creatures from the dark realm, and they want to destroy what remains of my people. And they have been tracking me since I entered your world." Jake wanted to run, and he wanted to call the police, and he wanted to wake up from whatever dream this was. But something in Lyria's eyes stopped him, and there was desperation there, and fear and hope all mixed together. "How do I know you are not dangerous?" he asked. "You do not," Lyria admitted. But your ancestor trusted my grandmother, and she gave him that ring as a promise and a bond between our peoples. And now I am calling in that promise." Jake looked at the ring again, and the symbols were definitely glowing now, and they seemed to form words in a language he did not know, but somehow understood. "Protect the light bearer," the symbols said, "and honor the ancient bond." His hand was shaking, and this was insane. And he should walk away right now, but instead he heard himself say, "Okay, and show me proof." Lyria's face lit up with relief, and she came around the counter quickly, and she was taller than he thought, and moved with an otherworldly grace. "Follow me," she said, "and we do not have much time." She led him to the back of the coffee shop, through a storage room, and out into a narrow alley. The morning sun barely reached down here, and the walls were covered in old graffiti. Lyria opened the leather bag and pulled out what looked like a crystal sphere. She held it up and whispered words in a language that sounded like singing, and the crystal began to glow. Images formed inside it. And Jake saw a world that was not Earth, and there were towers of white stone and forests with trees that had silver leaves and creatures that looked like dragons flying through purple skies. He saw armies of elves fighting against shadows that moved like living darkness, and he saw cities burning and people dying. Then he saw a man who looked startlingly like himself, and the man wore armor and carried a sword that blazed with light, and he stood beside an elf woman who looked like Lyria, your ancestor. Lyria said softly, and his name was Jonathan Morrison, and he came to our world by accident, through a portal, and he helped us defeat the Shadowborn in the Great War. But the war is starting again, and we need his bloodline. And we need you. Jake could not look away from the images, and they felt more real than anything he had ever experienced, i.e., Crystal showed the man Jonathan fighting alongside dragons and leading armies and saving a world that was not his own. Then the images faded and Jake was left staring at Lyria in a dirty alley behind a coffee shop. "This is impossible," he said. "It is happening." Lyria replied, "And will you help us, Jake Morrison, and will you honor your ancestors' promise?" Before Jake could answer, there was a sound like tearing fabric, and the air at the end of the alley split open. A dark shape stepped through, and it was tall and covered in shadows, and its eyes glowed red. "Run!" Lyria screamed, and she grabbed Jake's hand. They ran. They ran through the alley, and Lyria moved faster than any human could, and Jake struggled to keep up with her. The shadow creature behind them made a sound like grinding metal and screaming wind, and it was getting closer. "Turn left," Lyria shouted, and they burst out onto a busy street. People walked past them without noticing anything wrong, and Jake realized the creature must be invisible to normal people. Lyria pulled him into a parking garage, and they ducked behind a concrete pillar, and both of them were breathing hard. "What was that thing?" Jake gasped. "A Shadowborn hunter," Lyria said, and her violet eyes were wide with fear, "and they can track magical items across dimensions, and the ring I gave you called to them." Jake looked at the ring still clutched in his hand, and maybe he should throw it away, but something stopped him. The symbols on the ring were glowing brighter now, and they felt warm against his skin like they were alive. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Lyria said, "and there is a place I prepared for this, and a sanctuary." "Where?" Jake asked. "Not far," she replied, "but we must move quickly and more will come." They left the parking garage through a side exit, and Lyria led him through streets. Jake had walked 1,000 times, but now everything looked different. He kept seeing things from the corner of his eye, and shadows that moved wrong and shapes that disappeared when he looked directly at them. "Is that them?" Jake asked, and pointing at the shadows. "You are beginning to see," Lyria said. "And the ring is awakening your blood, and your ancestor had the gift of true sight, and he could see through all illusions." They reached an old apartment building on the edge of downtown, and Lyria pulled out a key and led him up 3 flights of stairs. The apartment was small but clean, and the walls were covered in maps and strange symbols drawn in silver ink. Lyria locked the door and pressed her hand against it, and the symbols on the door glowed briefly. "That will keep them out for a while," she said, but not forever. Jake collapsed onto a worn couch, and his mind was spinning. This morning he had been a normal person with a normal, boring life, and now he was running from shadow monsters with an elf woman who claimed his ancestor was a hero in another world. "Start from the beginning," he said, "and tell me everything." Lyria sat down across from him, and she folded her hands in her lap. "My world is called Ethermore," she began, "and it exists parallel to yours, and for most of history the two worlds never touched, and but 500 years ago a great tear opened between them. The Shadowborn came through that tear," she continued, "and they are beings of pure darkness, and they consume light and life and magic, and they nearly destroyed us. Your ancestor, Jonathan Morrison, was a soldier in your world," she said, "and he was fighting in a war, and an explosion should have killed him, but instead it threw him through a weak point between dimensions. He landed in Ethermore, and my grandmother found him, and she was a princess and a warrior, and together they fought the Shadowborn." Jake listened, and he wanted to not believe her, but the ring in his hand pulsed with warmth, and somehow he knew she was telling the truth. "Jonathan could not use magic like we could," Lyria said. But he had something we did not, and he had human determination and creativity and adaptability. He taught our warriors new ways to fight," she explained, "and he helped us forge weapons that could harm the Shadowborn, and he led the final battle that drove them back into the Dark Realm, And he wore this ring, Jake asked, and holding it up. My grandmother gave it to him, Lyria said, and it was forged from starfall metal and blessed by the dragon lords, and it was a symbol of the bond between our peoples. So why do you need me now, Jake said. And if you already won the war? Because the war is not over, Lyria replied, and her voice was heavy, and the Shadowborn found another way through. And 20 years ago they returned, and stronger than before. My people have been fighting them ever since, she said, but we are losing, and our numbers dwindle and our magic fades and the dragons sleep. The ancient prophecy said that in our darkest hour the bloodline of the Lightbringer would return. Lyria continued, and Jonathan Morrison was the Lightbringer and you are his descendant. Jake shook his head. But I am not a warrior, and I do not know how to fight monsters, and I work in a warehouse. Jonathan said. The same thing, Lyria smiled sadly. But he found his courage when it mattered, and the blood remembers. What does that mean? Jake asked. Put on the ring, Lyria said, and you will understand. Jake looked at the ring, and the symbols were still glowing, and he felt drawn to it in a way he could not explain. He slipped it onto his finger, and the world exploded with light. Images flooded his mind, and he saw through Jonathan's eyes, and he felt his ancestors' memories. He saw battles and victories and defeats, and he felt the weight of the sword and the heat of dragonfire, and the cold of the Shadow Realm. He saw Lyria's grandmother, and her name was Selene, and she was beautiful and fierce, and Jonathan had loved her. The memories faded slowly, and Jake found himself gasping on the couch, and Lyria was watching him with hope in her eyes. I saw it all, he whispered, and the war and the dragons and everything. The ring chose you, Lyria said, and it would not accept anyone who was not worthy. Jake looked at his hands, and they felt different somehow and stronger, and he could feel energy flowing through his body. But I still do not know how to fight, he said. You will learn, Lyria replied, and I will teach you. And more importantly, we must awaken the dragons, Jake said. And you mentioned them before, and are they real, very real? Lyria smiled, and I am bonded to 2 of them. And they are the last of the great dragon flight, and they sleep in your world hidden. You brought dragons here? Jake asked incredulously. I had no choice, Lyria said. And the Shadowborn were hunting them, and I opened a portal and brought them through, and they have been sleeping in the mountains north of this city for 3 years. Sleeping? Why, Jake asked. Because they used all their power to cross dimensions, Lyria explained. And they need the touch of the Lightbringer's blood to awaken. So you need me to wake up your dragons? Jake said. Yes, Lyria nodded. And then together, we must return to Ethermoor and join the final battle. Jake stood up and walked to the window, and outside the city looked normal, and people went about their lives not knowing that monsters from another dimension were hunting in the shadows. This is insane, he said. It is, Lyria agreed, but it is also true. And I cannot force you to help, but if you do not, my world will fall, and eventually the Shadowborn will consume this world too. Jake touched the ring and felt the warmth of it and the weight of his ancestors' legacy. How long do I have to decide? He asked. They will find this place by nightfall, Lyria said, and we must leave before then, and either to run and hide or to face what comes. Jake turned to face her, and in her violet eyes he saw the fate of 2 worlds hanging in the balance. He thought about his boring warehouse job and his empty apartment and his life that was going nowhere, and he thought about Jonathan Morrison, who had been just a soldier, but became a hero. Tell me how to wake the dragons, he said. Lyria's face broke into a brilliant smile, and together they would face the darkness. They left the apartment as the sun began to set, and Lyria had packed a small bag with supplies and weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum. Jake wore the ring, and he could feel it pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat, and everything looked sharper now and clearer. How far are the mountains? He asked as they climbed into Lyria's old car. 3 hours north, Lyria said, and starting the engine. And we should arrive by midnight, and that is when the veil between worlds is thinnest. The city lights faded behind them as they drove into the darkness, and Jake watched the landscape change from buildings to forests. Tell me about the dragons, he said, and breaking the silence. Their names are Ember and Frost. Lyria replied, and her eyes stayed on the road, and they are brother and sister, and I bonded with them when I was 16. How does bonding work? Jake asked. It is a joining of souls, Lyria explained, and a dragon chooses their rider. And once bonded, we share thoughts and emotions, and even life, force. So if they die, you die. Jake said. Yes, Lyria nodded, and if I die, they die. And it is the deepest connection possible. Jake was quiet for a moment, and that is a heavy burden, he finally said. It is also a gift. Lyria smiled, and you have never truly lived until you have flown on dragonback and felt the wind and touched the clouds. What are they like? Jake asked. And I mean their personalities. Ember is fierce and passionate, Lyria said, and her scales are the color of sunset, and she breathes fire that can melt stone, and she is protective and sometimes too quick to anger. And Frost is calm and thoughtful. She continued, and his scales are like ice crystals, and he breathes cold that can freeze a river solid, and he thinks before he acts, and he is wise beyond his years. They sound amazing, Jake said. They are, Lyria replied, and I miss them terribly, and sleeping they cannot speak to me, and I feel the emptiness where they should be. The mountains loomed ahead, dark against the night sky, and Lyria turned onto a dirt road that wound upward into the wilderness. They drove for another hour on rough terrain, and finally Lyria stopped the car near a massive cliff face. We walk from here, she said. Jake followed her through the forest, and the ring on his finger grew warmer with each step, and he could feel something pulling him forward like a magnet. Lyria moved through the darkness without hesitation, and her elf eyes could see perfectly in the night. Jake stumbled over roots and rocks, but he kept going. They reached a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall, and Lyria pulled out a glowing crystal that lit their way. The cave went deep into the mountain, and the walls were covered in ancient symbols that matched the ones on Jake's ring. This place is sacred, Lyria whispered, and it is a dragon sanctuary, and humans built it long ago when dragons and people lived in harmony. Jake felt the weight of history pressing down on him, and he wondered how many others had walked this path. They entered a massive cavern, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Two enormous shapes lay on the stone floor, and even in sleep they were magnificent. Ember was curled on the left, and her scales shimmered red and orange and gold like living flame, and she was easily the size of a bus. Frost lay on the right, and his scales glinted silver and blue and white like a glacier, and he was slightly larger than his sister. They are beautiful, Jake whispered. Lyria walked forward and placed her hand on Ember's massive head, and she spoke softly in the Elvish language. Jake could see tears running down her cheeks. She turned to him, and now, you must wake them and place your hand on each of them, and let the ring do the rest. Jake approached Ember first, and his legs felt weak, and up close he could see the individual scales and the powerful muscles beneath. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched her warm scales. The ring blazed with light, and energy flowed from Jake into the dragon. Ember's eyes snapped open, and they were molten gold, and she raised her head and looked directly at Jake. Lightbringer, she said, and her voice echoed in Jake's mind, and the blood remembers. Jake stumbled backward. And you can talk? Of course, young one, Ember replied, and you carry the scent of old Jonathan, and he was a good friend. Jake moved to Frost and placed his hand on the ice-cold scales. Again the ring flared, and Frost awakened. His eyes were crystal blue, and when he looked at Jake there was ancient wisdom. There, welcome, heir of Morrison, Frost said, and his voice was calmer than Ember's, and we have waited long for your coming. Both dragons stood and stretched their wings, and the cavern filled with the sound of leathery membranes unfurling. Lyria was laughing and crying at the same time, and she pressed her forehead against Ember's neck. I missed you, she said aloud. And we, you little flame, Ember rumbled, but now we are whole again. Frost looked at Jake. And you have questions, young human, and ask them. How do you know? About my ancestor, Jake said. We fought beside him, Frost replied, and dragons live very long lives, and we remember everything, and you will help fight the Shadowborn. Jake asked. We are bound to Lyria, Ember said, and where she goes we go. And besides, the Shadowborn are enemies of all living things, and they must be stopped. Can we really win? Jake asked quietly. That depends on you, Frost said, and you must find your courage as Jonathan did, and you must unite the humans and elves as he did. But I am nobody, Jake said. And I am just a warehouse worker. Jonathan was just a soldier, Ember countered, but he became the Lightbringer and the ring chose you for a reason. Jake looked at Lyria, and she nodded encouragingly. What do I need to do? He asked. First you must train, Frost said. And you must learn to fight and to channel the ring's power. And then Ember continued, and we must return to Ethermore and rally what remains of the free peoples. There is an army of Shadowborn marching on the last elf city, Lyria said, and they will reach it in 2 weeks. Then we do not have much time, Frost said, and we must begin immediately. The dragon lowered his massive head and climbed onto my back. Young Morrison, and it is time you learned. To fly, Jake looked up at the enormous creature and his heart pounded. You want me to ride you, he asked. How else will you learn? Frost replied. And there was amusement in his mental voice. Lyria was already climbing onto Ember's back, and she looked natural there and confident. Trust him, she called down to Jake, and I promise you will be safe. Jake took a deep breath and grabbed onto the spikes along Frost's neck, and he pulled himself up onto the dragon's back. The scales were cold, but not uncomfortably so, and Jake found a spot between 2 large spikes where he could sit. Hold tight, Frost said, and do not be afraid. The dragon moved toward the cave entrance, and Ember followed with Lyria on her back. They emerged into the night air, and Jake could see the forest far below. Then, Frost spread his wings and leaped into the sky. Jake screamed as they fell, and then the wings caught the air and they soared upward. The ground dropped away and the stars seemed close enough to touch, and the wind roared in Jake's ears. This is flying, Frost said, and this is freedom. Jake felt terror turn into exhilaration, and he laughed into the wind. Ember flew beside them with Lyria holding on, and her silver hair streaming behind her in. That moment, Jake understood why Jonathan Morrison had chosen to fight for a world that was not his own, because some things were worth fighting for, and some causes were bigger than one. Person's small life. Welcome to the war, Lightbringer, Ember said, and let us hope you are ready. Jake looked down at the ring glowing on his finger and then at the vast night sky before them. Ready or not, he said, and I am all in. The dragons roared in approval, and together they flew toward destiny. They flew for hours through the night sky, and Jake slowly learned to move with Frost's rhythm instead of fighting against it. The dragon taught him how to lean into turns, and how to grip with his legs, and how to become one with the flight below them. The world looked tiny and peaceful, and Jake could almost forget about shadow monsters and dying worlds as dawn broke. Lyria guided them to a clearing deep in the forest, and they landed smoothly. Jake's legs shook when he climbed down, and every muscle in his body ached. You did well for your first flight, Frost said, and most humans vomit or pass out. I came close to both. Jake admitted Lyria was setting up a camp, and she moved with practiced efficiency. We will rest here for a few hours, she said, and then we must begin your training for what exactly, Jake asked. Combat, Lyria replied, and sword work and channeling the ring's power. And strategy. In how much time, Jake said nervously. We have 5 days, Lyria said, and before we must open a portal to Ethermore 5 days to become a warrior. Jake laughed, and that is impossible. Jonathan learned in 3, Ember said helpfully. Great, Jake muttered, and no pressure. Then, they ate a simple breakfast, and then Lyria led Jake to an open area away from the camp. She drew a sword from her pack and tossed a second one to Jake. He caught it awkwardly, and it was heavier than he expected. First lesson, Lyria said, and a sword is not a club, and it is an extension of your arm. She showed him basic stances, and how to hold the blade and how to move his feet. Jake tried to copy her, but he felt clumsy and slow. Your body knows this, Lyria said, and the blood remembers, and let the ring guide you. Jake closed his eyes and focused on the warmth of the ring, and suddenly images flooded his mind. He saw Jonathan training and fighting and moving with deadly grace. When Jake opened his eyes, his stance had shifted, and the sword felt lighter. Good, Lyria smiled, and now defend yourself. She attacked, and Jake barely blocked in time, and the impact sent shocks up his arms. Again, Lyria said, and faster. They trained for hours, and Jake fell dozens of times, and his hands blistered, and his body screamed in protest. But slowly, something changed, and the movements became more natural, and the ring glowed brighter with each exchange by sunset. Jake was holding his own against Lyria's attacks for several seconds at a time. "Enough," Lyria finally said, "and you have done well." Jake collapsed onto the ground, gasping, and every part of him hurt. The dragons had been watching, and Frost approached. "Now you must learn the ring's true power," he said. "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "The ring does not just carry memories," Frost explained, "and it can channel magical energy, and it can create weapons of pure light." "Show me," Jake said, sitting up. Frost touched his nose to Jake's hand, and the ring blazed with white light. Jake felt energy pouring into him, and it was like lightning in his veins. "Focus that power," Frost instructed, "and shape it with your will." Jake concentrated, and the light flowed from the ring and formed into a glowing blade that extended from his hand. "A light sword," Frost said, "and it can cut through shadow, and it will be your greatest weapon against the Shadowborn." Jake stared at the glowing blade, and it hummed with power. "How long can I maintain this?" he asked. "That depends on your will," Frost said, "and Jonathan could hold it for an hour in battle, and you must practice." They practiced until Jake could summon the light blade at will and hold it for several minutes. The next 4 days followed the same pattern, and Jake trained from dawn until he collapsed from exhaustion. Lyria taught him strategy and tactics, and how to read a battlefield. Ember taught him how to fight from Dragonback and how to use aerial advantage. Frost taught him to control the ring's power and to see through illusions. Each night Jake dreamed of Jonathan and the First War, and he learned from those ancient battles. On the 5th morning Jake woke, feeling different, and the ring had become part of him, and his body moved with new confidence. Lyria watched him practice and smiled. "You are ready," she said. "Am I?" Jake asked. "No." Lyria laughed, "But no one ever truly is, and you will do well enough." That afternoon they prepared for the crossing. Lyria drew symbols on the ground in a complex pattern, and she placed crystals at specific points. "Opening a portal between worlds requires immense power," she explained, "and normally it would take a dozen elf mages, but you have dragons." Jake said yes. Lyria nodded, and the ring will help stabilize it." She took Jake's hand, and together we will open the way. They stood in the center of the symbol circle, and the dragons positioned themselves at the cardinal points. Lyria began chanting in the elvish tongue, and the crystals started glowing. Jake felt the ring growing hot, and energy began flowing from him into the pattern. The air shimmered and twisted, and reality started to tear. A circular opening appeared, and through it Jake could see another world. Rolling hills of silver grass and towers of white stone and a purple sky with 2 moons either more, Lyria whispered. But something was wrong, and Jake could see smoke rising from the towers and hear distant sounds of battle. "The Shadowborn reached the city early," Ember said, and her voice was tight with worry. "We must go now." Frost urged. They climbed onto the dragons, and Jake sat behind Lyria on Ember's backhold. "Tight," Lyria said. The dragons launched themselves at the portal, and Jake felt reality bend around them as they crossed between worlds. The transition was like being torn apart and reassembled, and Jake screamed, but no sound came out. Then they were through and flying over Ethermore. Jake gasped at the beauty of this alien world, and everything seemed sharper and more vibrant than Earth. But his wonder turned to horror as he saw the battle below. The last elf city was surrounded by a sea of writhing shadows, and the Shadowborn were climbing the white walls like a black tide. Elf warriors fought desperately on the battlements, and their arrows glowed with magic. But there were so many enemies. "We are too late," Jake said. "No," Frost replied, "and we are exactly on time, and look." Jake saw that his arrival had been noticed, and elf warriors on the walls were pointing up at them and shouting, "The Lightbringer returns," one of them cried, "and the prophecy is fulfilled." A great horn sounded from the city, and its note cut through the chaos. The Shadowborn seemed to hesitate, and their eyeless faces turned upward toward the dragons. Jake felt the ring burning on his finger, and power built inside him like a dam about to burst. Lyria looked back at him, and her violet eyes were fierce. "Show them what the bloodline of Jonathan Morrison can do," she said. Jake raised his hand, and the ring exploded with light. A beam of pure white energy shot from his palm, and it struck the center of the Shadowborn army. The shadows burned and screamed and scattered. "For the Lightbringer," Lyria cried. and for Ethermore the dragons roared and dove toward the battle. Jake held on and summoned his light blade, and together they fell upon the darkness. The final battle had begun, and Jake Morrison, warehouse worker from Earth, was about to become legend. The ring blazed on his finger and carried the hope of two worlds, and deep inside Jake felt Jonathan Morrison smiling, and his ancestor was proud. They would win this day or die trying, and either way the Lightbringer had returned. Ember dove through the purple sky like a meteor, and Jake held the light blade high as they crashed into the Shadowborn army. The creatures scattered from the burning light, and their screams echoed across the battlefield. Frost followed, and his breath turned hundreds of shadows into frozen statues that shattered when they hit the ground. Jake swung his blade, and each strike cut through multiple enemies, and the ring pulsed with power he had never felt before. On the city walls, the elf warriors cheered and renewed their defense with desperate energy. A voice boomed across the battlefield, and it came from a massive Shadowborn that stood taller than the rest. "So the heir finally comes," the creature said, and its voice was like grinding stones. But you are too late." Little human, Jake felt anger surge through him, and not too late to end you. The giant Shadowborn laughed. "And I am Malgrath, and commander of the Dark Army. And I killed your precious Jonathan in the first war, liar." Ember snarled, "And Jonathan died of old age in peace." "Did he?" Malgrath said. "And or did we simply let you believe that, and we have been waiting 500 years for his bloodline to return?" Jake felt doubt creep in, but the ring grew warmer and calmer. "Do not listen," Lyria said, "and he seeks to break your will." Malgrath raised his arm, and a wave of darkness shot toward them. Frost dodged, and the blast hit a tower, and stone exploded outward. The dragons separated, and Ember carried Jake and Lyria toward Malgrath, while Frost continued clearing the smaller Shadowborn. Jake could see elf warriors on the ground now, and they were pushing out from the city gates and driving back the enemy. A woman with a silver crown led them, and her sword blazed with blue fire. "That is Queen Thalia," Lyria shouted, "and my cousin, and the last of the royal line." The queen saw them and raised her sword in salute before diving back into battle. Ember circled Malgrath and looking for an opening. The creature was massive and easily 50 feet tall and made of condensed shadow that seemed almost solid. It carried a blade made of darkness that dripped with void. "Energy, come down and face me, little Lightbringer," Malgrath taunted, or are you afraid? Jake felt the ring's power building, and he knew what he had to do. "Lyria," he said, "and get me close." She understood immediately. "And Ember, we need a diving attack." The dragon roared agreement, and they climbed high into the purple sky. Malgrath watched them, and his red eyes glowing. Now Lyria screamed, and Ember folded her wings and dropped. They fell like a spear, and Jake poured all his energy into the light blade, and it grew to twice his height. Malgrath swung his dark sword up to meet them. The blades collided, and the impact created a shockwave that flattened everything within 100 yards. Jake felt his bones rattle, but he pushed harder, and the light blade cut through the dark sword and bit into Malgrath's shoulder. The creature howled, and black blood sprayed across the battlefield. Ember pulled up sharply, and Jake nearly fell, but Lyria caught his arm. "Good hit," Lyria said, but it is not enough." Malgrath clutched his wounded shoulder, and then he laughed. "You have your ancestors' fire," he said, but you lack his experience, and let me show you true darkness." The creature dissolved into pure shadow and vanished. "Where did he go?" Jake shouted, and looking around frantically. Everywhere Frost called out, "And be ready." The ground itself turned black, and shadows rose up around the elf warriors and began pulling them down. The dragons could not help without killing the elves, and the battle turned desperate. Jake felt helpless, and he had hurt Malgrath, but now the enemy was using a strategy he could not counter. Then he remembered something from Jonathan's memories, and in the final battle of the First War, his ancestor had done something impossible. He had channeled the ring's full power and created a burst of pure light that had driven back all the Shadowborn at once. But Jonathan had been older and stronger and more experienced. Jake was none of those things, and he had only been training for 5 days. Yet he had to try Lyria. He said, "And I need you to channel your magic into the ring," what Lyria said. "And that could kill you, and the power would be too much. Do it." Jake insisted, or we lose everyone. Lyria hesitated and then nodded, and she placed her hand over the ring and began channeling. Energy flowed into Jake, and it was agonizing, and his body felt like it was burning. From the inside Ember Frost he gasped, "And I need your power too." The dragons understood, and they flew close and touched their snouts to Jake. Ancient dragon magic joined the flow, and Jake screamed as power beyond imagining filled him. He could not hold it, and he was breaking apart, and the ring was burning his finger. But he thought of Queen Thalia fighting for her people, and he thought of Lyria searching for him across years and continents. He thought of Jonathan, who had given everything for a world not his own. And Jake held on. He raised both hands to the sky, and the ring blazed like a newborn. Starlight erupted from him in a wave that swept across the entire battlefield. The shadows burned away instantly, and Malgrath was forced back into solid form. The Shadowborn army was scattered and weakened, and many of them simply ceased to exist. Jake collapsed on Ember's back and barely conscious. "Finish it," he whispered to Lyria. She drew her sword, and Ember dove at Malgrath one last time. The creature tried to defend, but Lyria's blade found his heart, and she drove it deep. Malgrath looked down at the sword in his chest and then at Jake. "You are indeed his heir," he said. And perhaps we were wrong to fear you." Then the great Shadowborn commander dissolved into nothing, and the dark army broke and ran. The elf warriors cheered, and the battle was won. Ember landed gently near the city gates, and Queen Thalia ran to them. She helped Jake down from the dragon, and he could barely stand. "You saved us," she said, and tears streaming down her face, and the prophecy was true. Jake smiled weakly, "And I just did what needed doing." The queen laughed. "And you are very much like Jonathan." And he said the same words after saving us the first time. Lyria jumped down and embraced her cousin, and the two women held each other tight. Frost landed beside them, and well done. Young Morrison and Jonathan would be proud. Jake looked at his hand, and the ring still glowed, but fainter now. "Is it over?" he asked. "This battle?" "Yes," Frost replied, but the war continues, and the Shadowborn will regroup and return." "How long do we have?" Jake said. "Months," Frost said, "and perhaps a year." But today you bought hope. And that is worth more than any victory." Queen Thalia stepped forward. "And Jake Morrison, Lightbringer and heir of Jonathan, and on behalf of all Ethermore, I thank you." She knelt, and the entire elf army knelt with her. Jake felt embarrassed, and "Please stand. And I am nobody special." "You are wrong," Lyria said softly, "and you are exactly who we needed." The queen rose, "And you must stay with us and help us rebuild and help us prepare for when they return." Jake looked back at the portal, and it still shimmered in the distance. "What about Earth?" he asked, "and what about my life there?" "What?" "Life," Lyria said gently, "and you said yourself you were going nowhere, and here you have purpose, and here you matter." Jake thought about his empty apartment and his dead-end job and his lonely existence. Then he looked at Lyria and the dragons and Queen Thalia and the warriors who had fought beside him. Here he had found something he never had on Earth, and he had found people who needed him and a cause worth fighting for. "Okay," he said, "and I will stay." Lyria smiled brilliantly, and the dragons roared their approval. That night there was a great feast in the city, and Jake sat beside Lyria at the high table. Elf musicians played songs that made him want to cry and laugh at the same time. Queen Thalia stood and raised her cup, "And to the Lightbringer who returned to us, and may his light never fade." The entire hall cheered, "And to the Lightbringer." Jake felt Lyria's hand slip into his, and he squeezed gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "and for honoring your ancestors' promise." He looked at her, and her violet eyes reflected the firelight. "And thank you for finding me." In that moment, Jake realized that morning in the coffee shop had not been chance. It had been fate, and his ancestor had set this in motion 500 years ago. The ring on his finger pulsed warmly, and it felt like approval. Ember and Frost curled up nearby, and both dragons looked content. Jake Morrison had gone from warehouse worker to hero in less than a week, and somehow it felt absolutely right. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, and more battles certainly, and probably more danger. But he would face it with Lyria beside him and dragons above him, and an army of elves at his back. And he would make Jonathan Morrison proud. The feast continued, long into the night and under Ethermoor's twin moons, and for the first time in his life, Jake felt like he belonged. He had found his purpose and he had found his home. The Lightbringer had returned, and the darkness would learn to fear that light. Jake smiled and raised his cup, and to new beginnings. Around him the hall erupted in cheers and the celebration continued, and in the shadows far beyond the city the Shadowborn watched and waited. They would return and stronger than before. But so would Jake Morrison, and next time he would be ready. The ring glowed softly on his finger and carried the promise of battles yet to come. But tonight was for celebration and joy and hope. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Jake laughed at something Lyria said, and the sound echoed through the great hall. He was home at last.